Hello everyone, today we are going to be continuing on with chapter 4 and we're doing 4.2 congruent figures. And when we're talking about congruent figures, we're going to of course have to know what it takes for figures to be congruent. And all it means is that you have all congruent sides and all congruent angles. And every single side must be congruent and every single angle needs to be congruent. So if I'm looking at these two figures, the A, B, C, D, and the E, F, G, H, what it's saying is in order for these two things to be congruent, this side would have to be congruent to this one, this would have to be congruent to this, BC would have to be congruent to FG, and CD would have to be congruent to HG. Not only that, but every single angle would also have to be congruent. So A would be congruent to E, B to F, C to G, and D to H. Now that's a lot of congruent statements, and when you do this, if you know that the overall figures are congruent, you're actually able to make each of those as independent statements. But you do have to be careful. Notice that A and E are congruent, but A is definitely not congruent to F. You can physically see that they're different. So make sure that when you are making these congruency statements, you're pulling out the correct angles. In fact, we call these corresponding angles because they correspond in the sense that they have the same location in their figure. So A would be congruent to E and is therefore a corresponding angle to E. And we could keep doing that through our list where B corresponds to F, angle D corresponds to angle H, and last but not least, angle C corresponds to angle G. And yeah, I didn't go in order there, but that's okay as long as you have the corresponding angles listed in your congruency statements. Now we can also make congruency statements for these segments. So for instance, if I wanted to write these down, I could write down that AD, the line segment, is congruent to EH, the line segment. Now be careful, because I said AD, I have to say EH. And the reason why is you want the person to draw it the same way as drawn here and have the corresponding points. So A and E are corresponding, so if A comes first, E has to come first. D and H are corresponding, so if D comes first, H comes first. And so the rest of my statements will look like this. With each of these statements, you can again confirm that A corresponds with E, B corresponds with F. So the overall sides will have to be congruent to each other. Same thing with BC is congruent to FG, and CD is congruent to GH. Once you have all of these and you know that all of these are congruent, you can make an overall congruency statement. So I can name the figure A, B, C, D, and I know I can name it that because I can start at A and go around to each of those in order and not pick up my pen as I draw this picture. So A to B to C to D is giving me this overall shape. I can then make this whole figure congruent to the whole other figure, and I have to make sure that I stay in the same order. So since A corresponds with E, I'm going to replace it with E. B is going to correspond with F. C corresponds with G. And D is going to correspond with H. So it comes in that same order as the original figure. That does mean that your congruency statements might differ. So for instance, and I'm just going to write another one up here, if I had named my first character, or my first figure, CBAD, and I wanted to write a congruency statement, my congruency statement would mean the same thing, but my second figure would have a different name. Instead of C, I of course write G because that's corresponding, B goes to F, A goes to E, and D goes to H. So these two things mean the exact same thing, but they have different names, and you just have to confirm that the corresponding points are in the same spot. So now we have named our congruency statement. We've given our figures overall statements and also ones for each of their angles and each of their sides. But typically when we're doing this, we're actually going to be working with figures like triangles. And triangles are going to work the same way. I can say that these two triangles are congruent if I knew that each of the corresponding angles were congruent. So let me just tell you that right now, that this is true for those angles. And of course, we also need all the sides to be congruent, so I'll tell you that right now as well. Now, when you write your overall congruency statement, again, be careful that you have it in the same order. So let's start with this figure, and I'm just going to name it ABC because I like to be alphabetical. So A is equal or congruent to D. So I'm going to write, instead of A, D. B is congruent to E. So instead of B, I'm going to write E. And last but not least, C is congruent to F. So I'm going to write, instead of C, F. And that gives me this congruency statement. Notice that since I'm working with triangles, I do have to put the little triangle in front, even though we don't have to with figures that are larger than triangles. And that's just because lists of 3 letters or points can be mistaken for things like angles. So we just have to be clear that this isn't an angle, it's a full triangle. And just like before, I can do those same congruency statements as I had earlier. In fact, I don't even need the picture at this point. I know that angle A is going to correspond with angle D because of where they're located in my statement. And I know that angle B has to correspond to angle E because, again, of where it's located. Same with C. And I can name each of the sides of the triangle AB, BC, and CA, and even without my picture, make my congruency statements because I know that A and B correspond with D and E, and I know that B and C correspond with E and F, and I know that C and A correspond with F and D. And that would be all set. One final thing to notice, and that's that we have a bit of a special case with circles. Now, since circles don't really have sides or angles, the only thing that it takes for circles to be congruent is congruent radii. So for instance, if I know that this is a point C and this is a point D, if AC is congruent to BD, that means that their radii are congruent. And therefore, the two circles themselves are congruent. And I would be allowed to say that circle A is congruent to circle B. And don't forget that you should have that circle in front of it to name the circle, and you just name it according to its center point. Now what we want to do is we want to use this information. So we're going to be allowed to assume that two figures are congruent in these following pictures. Knowing that they're congruent, it wants us to find the missing lengths and angles in the following, assuming they're congruent, and also to include a congruency statement for the overall figures. So let's look at this one first. Here, when I'm looking at it, I can see that visibly it seems to be lined up exactly right, where this angle corresponds to this angle corresponds to this one, and this angle corresponds to that 55 one here. And it is always good to draw in your markings right away because it's going to make the equalities very easy, and it will also save you from making silly mistakes later. So I want to see you guys draw those in wherever possible. So since these two are equal, that means that T is going to equal 35 degrees. Also, notice how this one's missing a side from here to here. Well, I know that that side is 8.5, so I can fill that in. Also, in this next one, angle U, we have a right angle over here, so that means this too must be right angle or 90 degrees. When I come along this side, this is 6, so I can fill in S as 6 meters. When I get to V, I can see that that one is 55, so so I can go ahead and write 55 degrees. And last but not least, I have the hypotenuse of this right triangle, which is 10.4 meters. Now all I have to do is make congruency statements. So I'm going to name this triangle real quick, and I'm going to name this BMP. And this one is going to be QRS. So if I want to make an overall statement, I can say that BMP is congruent to QRS. And I can confirm B and Q correspond, M and R correspond, and S and P correspond because they're all in the same place in those triangles. Now this one's similar to the one above, only notice that one of the figures is rotated. So you're going to have to take a second to figure out which ones actually correspond. Well, first off, I can see that this angle is a right angle, and so is this one. So those must be corresponding angles. So I know that in this triangle, we're going to have C corresponding to P. Also, if I look, I've got like this tall pointy one. That should be pretty distinct from the others. So the tall pointy one over here is actually Q. So that means D is going to correspond with Q. And that of course leaves B corresponding to R. And notice that this is how mine ended up being named. As long as your figures have corresponding angles consistent in your answer, it is okay. We also are going to be able to then fill in all the missing lengths and sides. Here I'm going to start with my angles. I know that B and R are corresponding, so this can be 58 degrees, and D and Q correspond, so D has to be 32 degrees. Now be careful when you're doing the final sides. I can see here that the hypotenuse side opposite that right angle is 96, so that must also be true in this picture. But here I have the short leg and the long leg labeled, and this one's missing it. So my short leg should be 50 yards, and my long leg should be 81 yards. And I would be good to go. Which leads us to our final picture, and this one can get easily mixed up. Now we know that our two triangles are congruent, but they're also overlapping and a bit hard to work with. So what I'm actually going to do is I am going to leave this one where it is, and I'm going to kind of flip this other one around so that it's easier to work with. And you can do that right underneath or right alongside, just so that you have like a sketch to work with. And notice here how when I'm doing this, I'm flipping this guy over so that he's over here. And that means that this D actually flips down to here. And this point here, which has the smaller angle, is right along here. As we flip it around, that becomes that X, and it's that smaller angle. The slightly larger angle is going to be B, and we don't know the degree of that yet. And then last but not least, this D, goes into that bottom corner, so that means that from D to B is that 3.4, and from C to D is going to be that 4.7. Okay, so now we have this information, and notice that our sides line up properly. This should be 4.7. This should be 3.4. The question is, what about our other missing angles? Well, in this case, we know that A is 101, so D, that corresponding angle, must also be 101. And I know that B is corresponding with C, so that means that this too must be 32 degrees. And notice how both C and B are missing measures. Well, because of that, I'm going to have to do just a little bit of math. Don't forget that angles on the inside of a triangle add up to 180. So I know that 101 plus 32 plus the measure that I'm missing for B is going to be equal to 180. Here I can do a little bit of algebra to get 133 plus the measure of angle B is equal to 180. And when I subtract 133 from both sides, I find that the measure of angle B is 47 degrees. And I can fill that in for both B and C. Which leaves us with this congruency statement: ABC is congruent to D.